What's the best way to practice scales? Well, it depends on what you want to do with them. You see, there are different ways to use scales, so there are, not surprisingly, different ways to practice them. That's what I'm going to talk about here in this series. We're going to look at a number of different approaches to scales and what those benefits are from each of the different approaches. Here in part one, first I'll give you a little overview, some context so that we get started on the same page, and then I'm going to demonstrate how to approach positional scale patterns so that you memorize them quickly and efficiently and stop shooting yourself in the foot. A lot of people learn positional scale shapes and that's where they stop, and then they wonder why they can't, use the entire fretboard or flow between different patterns and so forth. So positional scale shapes are not the end of the story. They're just a starting point, but they're an important starting point, so that's where we're going to begin. The first step to getting started on the right foot here is to actually understand what a scale is. And this is important because the confusion that inevitably happens later on down the road always comes from the fact that players miss this step. What they do is they see a pattern on the neck. Oh, this is the C major scale, so they learn this pattern, they play through this pattern. And in fact, that's not true. The patterns on the neck reflect a scale, but they're not the same thing as the scale. Now, you might think that's kind of nitpicking because, what's the difference? It's reflected in the scale or it is the scale. But actually, it turns out to be a very crucial distinction because if you learn, let's say, the C major scale, you learn a pattern and you're thinking, well, that is the C major scale, then you're going to be very confused when suddenly the same C major scale shows up as another pattern and another and another and another, and all these different patterns are C major on the one hand, and on the other hand, that same original C major pattern that you learned, you also learn that it can be a whole bunch of other scales. So this can become very confusing if you start off with this kind of ironclad thinking that the pattern is the scale. Okay, so right there, we've got to dial it back and we've got to say, no, this is a way that the scale can show up, and in one context, it would be C major, but in other musical contexts, that same pattern can be other things. What we do is you listen to music, and then we evaluate the music and we extract some ideas from that music. So we take the tones out of the music that it's using and we arrange them in order, we stack them up, and we call that a scale. So a scale is a theoretical structure and it comes from music. What is a scale technically? It is simply a collection of tones used in music or commonly used in music. That's what a scale is. So we look at music, we extract the tones, and we stack them up. Well, to stack them up, you have to have a starting point. We call that the root of a scale. What note is actually becoming the root is the tonal center. So over here in music, you have a tonal center. You don't have a root. And then we extract the tones out, we stack them up, the tonal center becomes the root, and we look at it from the root on up. Now, when you go to play that pattern, if you start the scale on the root, you are orienting your ear to hear that note as a tonal center. Because whenever you hear notes, you hear them in relation to each other, and you need to orient your ear to hear a tonal center, or it's not going to sound the same. So if you played the C major scale and you're playing a pattern on the guitar and you're starting on a note other than C, you're kind of off on the wrong foot already, because yes, those notes are part of the C major scale, but if you don't orient your ear to hear C as a root, you're not really listening to it as the C major scale. When you look at a scale, like I said, it's a theoretical structure, but when you play that scale, it is music in a sense, because it's sound and we're hearing it as sound, so you hear a tonal center as you play. And this is the bottom line. If you play a scale but you don't establish tonal center, then you really aren't playing that scale. If I played the C scale but I'm hearing the tonal center of A, I'm actually playing the A minor scale. I'm actually hearing it as A minor. And what we want to do is we want to line these things up. You want to play the scale, practice the scale in a way that makes the scale sound like what you're thinking it is. Because if you're thinking C major, but you're hearing A minor, you're already confusing yourself. And this actually turns out to be one of the biggest obstacles to learning scales on the neck. Because you see, in the basic positional shapes, we don't have this problem because the root of the scale we're learning is at the bottom. So those work out pretty nice. But as we go to learn other shapes and other parts of the neck, suddenly the root is not available at the bottom of the scale pattern, so the scale doesn't sound right anymore. And as we're trying to learn these, the fact that it doesn't sound right ends up creating all sorts of problems. So we need to understand this up front before we get deep into scales. That issue of orienting your ear to tonal center is really why it's a good idea to start scales in their positional form, because the positional forms generally line up in such a way that the root is the lowest note in the pattern, and that sets your ear up to be able to hear what it is that you're playing. So if you're playing a C major pattern, you're hearing it as C major. If you're playing an A minor pattern, you're going to hear it as A minor because you're going to start on A. Another advantage of the positional shape is that the common chord shapes that we learn sit with the scales. So, for example, if we're looking at C major here, the bar chord, the first bar chord that we all learn is this major bar chord, the E form bar chord up the neck. Well, here at the 8th fret, it's C major. So the C major scale that is positional sits with this chord. And integrating that underlying chord grid with the scale, that's actually another approach we're going to hit later on. And it's a very important approach in terms of being able to actually use the scale, especially to pull out its melodic qualities. This is why positional scale shapes are so important, is because they all lay with these different chord shapes. And that's something that we're going to hit later. In any case, now we're going to come back to actually how we're just going to memorize the positional scale shapes efficiently. The mistake that most players make when they're trying to learn a large positional shape is they just start at the beginning and they try to play the whole thing all the way through, and inevitably they're messing up 20, 30, 40, 50% of the time. And that's not the most efficient way to get something memorized, is to keep throwing wrenches in and making mistakes. You're far better off to take a small piece at a time and learn it a small piece at a time and then put those pieces together. You know, if I gave you 12 names and I said, memorize these 12 names and now list them back to me, read them back from memory, most of you probably couldn't do it. I know I couldn't do it. So, you know, trying to do large chunks and memorize large things really isn't a very efficient way of doing it, regardless of whatever it is. But if I gave you 3 names and then gave you a story attached with those 3 names so that we talked about those people a little bit, and you got to know each of them, and then 3 more names, and we got to know them, and 3 more, and 3 more, and you got to know each of these people pretty well, well, now you could probably go through those 4 groups of 3 people and identify all those names. It's the same thing here on the guitar. What we want to do is we want to take this big structure, all these notes on all these 6 strings, and we want to break it into smaller bits. I suggest breaking it down into string pairs. I'll demonstrate this using A natural minor, but keep in mind here that I'm not just trying to teach you the A minor scale. That's not the point. The point is I want to demonstrate how to memorize any positional scale. So we're going to show you the approach which you should use, not just for this scale, but for all of the scales that you're learning, anything that's in a positional pattern. We're going to take A minor. We're going to start here at the 5th fret on this note A, and I'm just going to play the lowest string pair. So that's pretty easy. Strings 6 and 5 use exactly the same fingering, 1, 3, 4, 1, 3, 4. So not too hard to get that down. The next string pair is this. Now, inevitably, when we're talking about scales, fingering issues come up. And it's kind of a tricky thing because fingering isn't written in stone. It depends on where you're going. If I'm going to, let's say, stay on this string pair and cycle on it, I might use a different fingering than if I were just passing through in one direction or another or contouring, the pattern. But in this particular case, I want to use the same fingering that I would use if I were playing through the entire pattern. So I'm going to stay in 5th position, and then I'm going to shift to 4th position just on this one string, and then back. Then memorize the final string pair up here. Play that pattern repeatedly a few times till that starts to sink in. It probably won't take very long because we're only doing, small chunks. The next step would be to combine those string pairs. So let's do the first 2 together. And then also the other 2. Once that's comfortable, now of course put all the strings together, do the whole pattern. The next thing sounds quite simple, but it's something that most people don't do. Slow down. I mean, playing it at a speed that causes you to keep making errors isn't doing you any justice. It's not doing you any good. It's just shooting you in the foot. So slow down a little to make sure that you're guiding your fingers into the right place until it becomes a habit. The point of what we're doing here is that we want to get the pattern under our fingers, meaning that we want to put it into unconscious muscle memory so that we know the pattern and it's sort of on autopilot. You can think about the pattern, you can imagine it, you can see it, and your fingers will go over it without a lot of trouble. Now, you might make a mistake once in a while, and it's not the worst thing in the world if that happens, but you just don't want to encourage yourself to make a lot of mistakes. And players typically will push it to the point that they're making more mistakes than are useful. You don't want to be playing with glitchy, fast notes and then slow notes and then have hesitations in your playing. You want to be able to get through the whole thing, and you can only do that at the speed of probably the most difficult motion within the pattern. So don't race through the pattern. There is plenty of time later after you memorize the scales to turn them into licks or to play licks that utilize those scales, and then hone your technique and push up your speeds. But when you're memorizing the scale pattern, the point isn't the speed that you're getting through it. And a lot of people, think that they're just too impatient. They just want to play it fast. They want to play it fast now. Well, that's really counterproductive. So the second thing, slow down. And finally, a third approach to nail down these positional shapes is start with one note and then add one note at a time and create a cycle where you're going up and back down. Each time you go up, you add another note on top and you play a little bit more of the scale over and over and over, like this. Start on the first note, add one note, then 2, then another. So there, you might have noticed I started, adding one note at a time. Then I actually started doubling it, like I would play it twice on one note and then add one more. I like to double as I'm playing these, actually, because as you go to play something, the point is reliability. The point is to get this thing memorized and so that your fingers have a certainty to them. So we don't just want to do it once and say, oh, well, obviously I have it, I did it, because you can do something once right and then mess up still the second time or the third time. So it's a good idea to at least play it twice, just to make sure you can do it right 2 times. That's not a guarantee that, you have perfect reliability, but of course, it's a little better. So I think it's a good practice. You don't have to do that, but it would be my suggestion. So start at the bottom, go up 1 note at a time, play each one twice, then add another note, and keep going through the whole thing. That whole process through a large scale pattern, 6 strings, 3 notes on most strings, that's going to be a pretty long exercise. And by the time you're done with that, you're going to know, especially the lower part of that scale, you're going to know it really, really well because you've gone through it so many times. That, however, of course, focuses mostly on memorizing the lower part of the scale. So what you want to do next is you want to flip it around, start at the top, and add 1 note at a time coming down like this. And keep going like that. What's next after you get a bunch of your positional scale shapes down? Well, there are really 3 different areas that we have yet to look at. One area is contouring and sequencing. You see, we tend to use scales the way we see them. And if the only way you practice a scale is playing up and down through it, then that's going to tend to be the thing that occurs to you as to how to use it. But that's only one way, just doing the scale run, that might be something you want to do, of course, but it's not the only way to use a scale. And so when we start learning how to contour and sequence these scales, we start getting away from the pattern and we start thinking of the scale more in terms of its abstract musical structure. Then we can create more complex, more interesting structures from those scales, and we can create patterns or ways of playing those scales that we would never think of just by playing through them. After that, the next thing is being able to connect all of these positional shapes together so that you have free rein over the entire fretboard. So that's another approach and a number of specific ways to practice to accomplish that. And then finally, I'm going to come back full circle to something that I said up front here about anchoring the chord grid underneath the scale, and that causes you again to see the scales differently and therefore to use them differently, and that's a key to melodic playing. So when you see all that together, when you see the scales in terms of their chord grids and you understand how to use them melodically, whether we're talking about slow melodies or using melodic principles within licks, either way, it's still going to add another dimension to your playing. So you'll have that aspect. You'll also be able to float freely wherever you want to go on the fretboard, and you'll understand the musical structure. So you stop playing so much out of the pattern and you start playing out of the sound and out of the structure that you understand in your mind. The mistake I think a lot of players make is they start and they learn some of these positional shapes, but then they get bogged down or they don't have a methodology to continue. And that's what I'm providing here, of course. Now, what I'm giving you here in this series, though, is an overview of how to approach it, even with some examples, but I'm not exactly feeding you step by step. Here's a path to follow to cover the whole thing. If you want that, you're going to have to come over and join me on Patreon. Be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell. I'll see you in the next video.